Hi there. Miss me much? Well, it's time to get back to what movies I've been watching, this time looking back at November 2021. Sorry for a bit of a delay, but to be honest, I've just been crazy busy. So let's not waste any more time and get straight into those films. Starting with the ones I watched at home. So clearly because October was such a fantastic month and clearly my life was getting far too easy, simple and enjoyable, I decided to watch Parallel. The story of a bunch of smart, trendy young app developers who get pipped to the punch when their programmer undercuts them to their financiers. So, in a drunken bout of self-satisfied commiserating, they wind up finding a magical door to their house's shared attic, where there's a kind of crazy mirror that lets you step into alternate realities. But as soon as they know they can skip into alternate realities, they start heading over and emptying their own bank accounts from themselves in other universes and stealing art and ideas that doesn't exist in their own universe. Only, inevitably this brings out the worst in absolutely everybody and it all starts going horribly wrong. Now, there actually are some really good ideas in this film and some decent work from, well, that guy who was the bad guy in Mr.Robot, who's to be honest the only recognisable face here. And the plot feels like somebody took the idea of the old Danny Boyle film Shallow Grave. You know, the one where they get the big bag of drug money and then they end up all using it for bad purposes. And anyway, also the film Flatliners, that 80s movie recently remade with Elliot Page, all about medical students killing and resuscitating themselves to see what happens after death. Well, this isn't actually anywhere near as good as either of those movies, so yeah, I would say this was a 2 out of 5 at best, with the characters far too thinly sketched, the plot messy, and despite a kind of fun finale, it's a bit of a slog to get through to the end, so yeah, not much to recommend this. Maybe in an alternate universe this was fantastic, but not in this one. Another less than stellar Sunday night movie was Aftermath. Now on paper this sounds like a great setup. Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's like a semi-retired architect, builder, handyman, built like a tank but with a kind heart, and he's all about his wife and soon-to-be mum-daughter. Then tragedy strikes when a weird strange events conspire in air traffic control and Scoot McNairy ends up sort of semi-responsible for a plane crashing and everyone getting dead because of the ground. So what can Arnie do but investigate, seeking out truth, and maybe even team up with depressed and suicidal Scoot to get to the bottom of this, kicking names and taking ass? Only it's not really that kind of movie at all. This is a kind of a bit of a slow burn, sad true story about how these guys both deal with a related trauma. Only it's not actually all that good or interesting, and let's face it, Arnold Schwarzenegger's never actually been a great actor, and even less so these days in his post-Governator existence. And while Scoot McNairy genuinely is a good actor, seen in films like Monster, which genuinely he's brilliant, in this film he doesn't have a huge amount to work with. So when it all finally winds up, you're left wondering why you still feel like you barely know these characters and feel like you must have missed whatever the essential point of this film really was. So yeah, another 2 out of 5. It really did have potential, but most of it got squandered. Still, nothing I'd seen so far this month was as bad as Chaos Walking. This is an adaptation of a young adult novel, or YA novel, The Knife of Something or Other, and is all set on this colony planet in the future where everything's basically your pretty normal crap western farmer future a la Firefly, but on a world where men's thoughts appear as a kind of audio-visual noise emanating from their heads, but only men's thoughts. Which is kind of lucky as there's no women, apparently, because aliens killed them all, apparently. Anyway, Spider-Man lives there and then one day Rey Skywalker walks up and she's like, "What's all this?" And then Hannibal the mayor's like, "She's bad, let's steal her spaceship," and then a lot of fucking nonsense ensues, and it's not fun, it's not big, it's not clever. Honestly, with the people involved in making this, I have no idea how it turned out quite this bad, but it did. I mean, this is the same director who made The Bourne Identity back in the day, and made Edge of Tomorrow. I mean, seriously, Edge of Tomorrow. One of the best action films made in years, one of the best sci-fi films in years. But then I do suppose he has had his share of mediocrity over the years as well. But this is basically just garbage. I mean, they never made a sequel, thank God, even though they're like 4 books or something, and this bombed without trace. So, 1 out of 5, let's hope it stays bombed and gone, and let this film's noise no longer be heard. Slightly better, though not by a huge amount, was Dave Made a Maze. And this is all about Dave, who's an unemployed guy whose much more successful girlfriend comes home one day to find he's built a cardboard maze. Indeed, a labyrinth. And he's stuck inside. Only he won't come out, or he can't come out, and then he insists on them not actually damaging the maze, and then she invites pals round, and during the sort of weird Dave pity party they eventually try and crawl inside, only to find it's not just a little model he's made. Somehow once you're inside it, it's an actual giant maze with traps and monsters and a minotaur running around. And of course, you don't have to be a genius to work out that this is all really just a big metaphor for Dave's own feelings of failure and being trapped in an incredibly on-the-nose way. Now, this is one of those kind of bonkers indie idea movies where somebody thought, "I've got a wacky idea," and they just ran with it. And then they just kept adding scenes and scenes until the script was at least 90 pages long and they felt they could make a movie. Unfortunately, it all ends up being kind of ropey and unsatisfying. But I mean, credit where credit's due. It's a fun concept, and they really clearly had some fun and clever stuff with the maze sets and props, and the fact that everything's made out of cardboard. There's a lot of ingenuity, and there's an awful lot of film references actually in here. The trouble is, the actual minute-to-minute dialogue isn't very good, there's too many characters, and every scene and every sequence in the film usually goes on about 2 minutes too long. And 2's a good number because I'd give this 2 out of 5. It's just not interesting or funny enough to maintain what could have been a fun episode of a 30-minute zany TV show like Mythic Quest or something. But yeah, as a 90-minute movie, it's too long and too dragged out, so this is another one I'm afraid I can't really recommend. Meanwhile, in the land of cinema multiplexes, The Eternals makes the great neck splutter into the ever-churning Disney content train of consumerism rolling through the world. Too cynical? Okay. Anyway, it's all about the Eternals, who are an immortal band of superheroes put on Earth to defend humanity from the Deviants, which are kind of like weird dinosaur alien things. But these days they've all got different lives, and it's only when tragedy strikes and the Deviants start to return that they decide to get the band back together. But is something else afoot? What do you think? They've got 2 hours to fill. Anyway, so I'm just kind of completely over all this MCU nonsense at this point, and all these films are kind of cookie cutter and very samey. And I'll be honest, this film isn't awful, but it's really mediocre. And I didn't care about the characters, because to be honest, neither does the script. There's far too many of them, not enough time devoted to each or any of them, and the film's plot is incredibly languid and boring. I mean, it's nice to look at,
Isn't it?
but we're so far away from what the old MCU films actually cared about that I've completely lost interest. Now, I know this is a film by Chloe Zhao, and everyone's made this big thing about that she's this next upcoming Oscar-winning director, but I haven't seen Nomadland. But I did hear it's a lot of people sitting around and talking, and it's supposed to, that's the thing about it, it's that kind of indie movie, and I do like films like that, but the problem is this is an MCU movie where, for most of the movie, it's people sitting around talking and they're boring characters. So yeah, I mean this is it. 3 out of 5 for this. It could have been a lot worse. It's certainly not the end of the world, but ironically the best bit of the film were the occasional cameos by Jon Snow from Game of Thrones as one of the Eternals' human and very mortal boyfriends, who might actually just be his own superhero in a spin-off movie or something, because to be honest, that's what happens with all these things with just about every character these days. So, Last Night in Soho. That's the new movie by Edgar Wright. Now, if you're my age and you're from the Yakuza, if you're my age and you're from the UK, you probably know Edgar Wright as the director of the Simon Pegg and Nick Frost vehicles like the TV comedy show Spaced from back in the late 90s, which started all their careers, or Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, and if you're a bit younger, then maybe something like Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and Baby Driver. I mean, all of which are pretty solid bits of entertainment, proving that he can handle capably action and comedy with no small measure of aplomb and ability. The difference here is this is Wright trying his hand at a proper horror film. Kind of, but I'll get to that. You see, unlike Shaun of the Dead, which was a comedy with horror elements, this is very much a horror movie front and foremost. Because Soho, as I'll call it, is the story of Eloise, and she's a country girl from Cornwall who wants to move to London to be a student and part of the big fashion world. The trouble is, she's also suffering from an unspecified mental illness, and pretty quickly she finds her flat in London and the whole life there overwhelming, and what with the scene kids and the bullies and the drink and the sex and the partying, she decides very quickly to get a wee cheap bedsite in a random street where Diana Rigg has a wee place. Only, whenever she goes to sleep, she starts living out the life of a 1960s girl called Sandy, who's this gorgeous wannabe lounge singer who gets noticed by Doctor Who man Matt Smith and gets ushered into the seedier side of underground London life, all the same time being creeped out by people and things around her. And look, it's not awful. I mean, despite the 2 out of 5 score this is going to get at the end, it's actually a decent film because Wright knows how to shoot an amazing scene, and some of the stuff with Sandy and Eloise switching out during early scenes, and there's a big amazing dance hall scene, that's absolutely massively done. It's shot, it looks and sounds great, and it's everything you'd expect from the guy who did Baby Driver. The problem is, this is kind of a painfully slow film. And it's a film that's desperately trying not to show its hand too early, because you realise later on, it's because it really doesn't have that much going on for it. The characters are shallow, the dialogue's basic, the story swings from ridiculous to daft, and it isn't as funny as his previous work when it tries to be funny, and it's never really scary. Instead it just ends up being boring, obvious, and a bit grim. And in a way, I think this is trying to be a bit like a giallo, like the Dario Argento films like Suspiria and Big Red and stuff like that. But even with that case, or even if it's trying more to be a bit more like Hitchcock, which I didn't feel as much, it just never works, it doesn't land, and ultimately it ends up being a bit of an empty experience, which is a real shame. Thankfully though, I did actually see one pretty good film this month, and that was The French Dispatch. Now this is the latest movie from Wes Anderson, who you might remember me waxing lyrically about earlier in the year about The Grand Budapest Hotel or Fantastic Mr. Fox. Well, this time it was his weird and unusual eye turned towards a love letter to newspaper journalism, and more specifically the kind of old periodicals like Life magazine or The New Yorker and the many great writers who used to write for them. And the film takes place as a kind of visual reenactment of the final ever issue of the paper, The Liberty, and it takes the form of several stories, including a long lecture on a psychotic artist in prison and his masterpiece, and a bit about a French student uprising, and then a whole food writing section about police dinners. Now, what's amazing about it is it's absolutely brilliant, beautifully shot, really funny, and I hate to drop into that old cliche of, if you like this sort of thing, it's the sort of thing you'll like. But, I mean, I'm really not what else to say other than you should know what Wes Anderson's about by this point, and it's him at his most Wes Anderson-y. So if you're into that, you're going to have a fantastic time. And it genuinely is a good movie, but maybe if you don't like what you're seeing on screen, and you don't like the sound of the kind of weird, bizarre stuff he does, maybe skip this one and go see something else. That's all I can really give for you. So that was November. And apologies because this really has taken a long time to get out, but to be honest, I literally was working every single weekday of the whole of November and was very busy at the weekend, so I had literally no time to put together anything other than the occasional things I would see and occasionally actually managing to note something down, but I didn't actually get a chance to record this until, well, we're now into January at this point. So yeah, December will be coming hot on the heels of this because I had even less time to watch films in December, so it'll be a shorter list, but I'll try and do something a little special with that one. But until next time, these have been my grumpy opinions. And a special thanks to all my patrons, and most especially my top tier patrons Judith Coloma, Laurie Laporte and Michelle Forbes. Thanks guys, everyone keep it real, keep safe, and take care of yourselves. Bye bye.